The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, was a devastating conflict fought between the United States, the Union, and 11 southern states that seceded to form the Confederate States of America. Rooted in disputes over slavery and states' rights, the war erupted with the Confederate assault on Fort Sumter and concluded with a Union victory. It preserved the nation's unity, abolished slavery for nearly 3 million enslaved people, and claimed the lives of more than 620,000 Americans. In the closing months of 1860, a quiet unease gripped the United States. The nation, not yet a century old, stood at the edge of self-destruction. What had begun as a debate over rights, laws, and morality was turning into something darker. The Founding Fathers had hoped the experiment in democracy would prove that freedom and unity could coexist, but by 1860, that vision was breaking apart. The issue that lay at the heart of the fracture was slavery, an institution so deeply woven into the nation's fabric that it seemed impossible to remove without tearing the whole cloth. The North and South had long grown along separate paths. In the industrialized North, cities rose, railroads stretched across the land, and the rhythm of progress echoed in factories and workshops. Immigrants filled the ports of New York and Boston, drawn by the promise of wages and liberty. The southern states, by contrast, remained rooted in agriculture, vast plantations of cotton, tobacco, and sugar sustained by enslaved labor. While northern states increasingly saw slavery as a moral wrong and an obstacle to free labor, the South viewed it as essential not only to its economy, but to its identity. The political balance between these regions had always been fragile. Every new state entering the Union sparked arguments. Would it be free or slaveholding? In 1820, the Missouri Compromise had drawn an uneasy line between freedom and bondage. The Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 tried to postpone the inevitable, but each solution only deepened resentment. Bleeding Kansas, the violent conflict that erupted over slavery's expansion, was a warning of the blood yet to come. Then, in November 1860, came the spark. Abraham Lincoln, a tall, self-taught lawyer from Illinois, was elected the 16th President of the United States. His campaign had promised to stop the spread of slavery into new territories, not to abolish it where it already existed, but to prevent its expansion. To the South, this was intolerable. Southern leaders saw Lincoln's victory as proof that they had lost their voice in the Union. They feared their economy and their social order were now at the mercy of Northern politics. On December 20th, 1860, the state of South Carolina acted first. Its delegates gathered in Charleston and voted unanimously to secede from the United States. Church bells rang, crowds cheered, and newspapers declared the birth of a new era. Within 6 weeks, 6 more states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They met in Montgomery, Alabama, in February 1861 to form a new nation, the Confederate States of America. Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator from Mississippi and Secretary of War, was chosen as their president. For many Southerners, this was not rebellion, but self-preservation. They believed secession was a constitutional right that, just as the colonies had split from Britain, they too could leave a government they no longer trusted. For the North, however, secession was an act of treason. The Union, they believed, was not a voluntary alliance, but a perpetual nation forged in revolution and bound by law. In Washington, the mood was grim. Outgoing President James Buchanan declared that secession was illegal, but claimed he had no power to stop it. Federal forts and arsenals in the South began to fall into Confederate hands. The Union's authority was crumbling. When Abraham Lincoln finally took the oath of office on March 4, 1861, the nation was already divided into 2 flags, 2 governments, and 2 destinies. In his inaugural address, he spoke with calm resolve. He promised not to invade the South, not to end slavery where it existed, but he also declared that secession was unlawful. A house divided against itself cannot stand, he had said years earlier, and now those words became prophecies. He appealed to the better angels of our nature, urging reconciliation. But behind the words was the unspoken truth that if persuasion failed, force might follow. The flashpoint came in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. There, standing defiantly in the water, was Fort Sumter, one of the last Union strongholds in the South. Major Robert Anderson commanded a small garrison, cut off and running out of supplies. The newly formed Confederate government demanded its surrender. Lincoln faced his first great decision. To abandon the fort would mean recognizing the Confederacy as legitimate. To reinforce it risked war. In early April 1861, Lincoln chose a middle path. He sent ships to resupply the fort with food and essentials, not weapons, and informed the Confederate authorities of his intentions. But in the charged atmosphere of secession, even food could be seen as provocation. On April 12th, before the supply ships could arrive, Confederate artillery under General P.G.T. Beauregard opened fire. For 34 hours, shells rained down on the fort, lighting the sky over Charleston. The defenders returned fire, but the odds were hopeless. On April 14th, Major Anderson surrendered. The American flag was lowered over Fort Sumter. No one died in the bombardment itself, but the echoes of the guns would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. The war had begun. Lincoln's response was swift and decisive. On April 15th, he called for 75,000 volunteers to put down what he called a rebellion too powerful to be suppressed by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. Across the North, men flooded enlistment offices, clerks, farmers, students, and tradesmen, signing their names for a cause few fully understood. In the South, the call to arms was answered with equal fervor. Within days, for more states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee joined the Confederacy. The line was drawn. 11 states now stood against the Union. In Richmond, Virginia, the new Confederate capital, bells rang as Jefferson Davis declared that Southerners would fight for independence, for honor, and for the right to govern themselves. In the North, Lincoln's government mobilized on a scale the young republic had never known. Railroads became lifelines. Factories roared with the forging of cannon and rifles. Few on either side imagined the scale of what was coming. Many believed the war would be short, a few decisive battles, perhaps, followed by negotiation. In the spring parades of 1861, Union volunteers marched off to cheering crowds, confident they would be home by Christmas. Southern soldiers spoke of defending hearth and home, certain that one grand victory would secure recognition from Britain or France. Yet beneath the optimism, the deeper struggle was already forming. This was not merely a contest of armies. It was a war over ideas. What did it mean to be an American? Was the Union a binding promise or a voluntary pact? Could freedom endure while millions remained enslaved? In private letters, soldiers wrote of doubt and duty, of mothers' prayers and ministers' sermons. Newspapers argued over constitutional rights and divine justice. In the pulpits of North and South alike, preachers found scripture to bless their cause. Each side believed that God stood with them. But in the silence between cannon and prayer, the truth was clear. A nation built on liberty was now dying by its own hand. As the smoke rose over Fort Sumter, the United States ceased to be united. It had entered a darkness from which it would emerge transformed, scarred, but reborn. The fracture that had begun with words would now be settled with blood. The spring of 1861 marked the end of compromise and the beginning of America's great trial. The war that followed would test whether a nation conceived in liberty could survive its own contradictions. It was the moment the United States stopped debating its ideals and started fighting for its soul. The war had begun, but few on either side understood the scale of what was coming. In the spring of 1861, the North and South mobilized for what they still imagined would be a brief and decisive conflict. The first clash at Fort Sumter had fired more than cannonballs and had awakened two nations from illusion. Families divided along battle lines, factories roared to life, and politicians rushed to justify the blood that would soon stain the continent. The United States was dissolving, not by words this time, but by the thunder of war. As the smoke cleared from Charleston Harbor, both governments began to organize. In Washington, President Abraham Lincoln faced a colossal task. The Union Army barely existed, less than 17,000 men, scattered across distant outposts from the frontier to California. Most were officers and garrison troops, unprepared for the vast war now forming. Yet, within weeks, the North's industrial might began to turn. Railroads became arteries of mobilization, telegraph lines spread like veins, and the factories of New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts began producing uniforms, rifles, and ammunition at a speed the world had never witnessed. In Richmond, the newly formed Confederate government was doing the same, but with fewer resources and a stronger belief in personal valor over industry. Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, took command of a people convinced that their spirit, their commanders, and their cause would outweigh the North's numbers. The Confederate Constitution mirrored much of the old U.S. document, but enshrined slavery at its core. Cotton was king, they believed, and Europe's hunger for Southern cotton would not allow them to fail. By the summer of 1861, the war's first major battle loomed. Both sides looked to Virginia, where the Confederate capital at Richmond stood as the heart of rebellion. Just 30 miles from Washington lay Manassas Junction, a railway hub linking the Shenandoah Valley with the Confederate interior. Lincoln, urged by public impatience, ordered General Irvin McDowell to march south and strike before the Confederates could strengthen. The Union Army, green, ill-trained, and still dressed in mismatched uniforms, marched out amid cheering crowds. Civilians followed in carriages, bringing picnic baskets, expecting to witness a brief and glorious fight that would end the rebellion by sundown. On July 21, 1861, the armies clashed near a small creek called Bull Run. The battle began well for the Union. Their early assaults pushed Confederate lines back. But the arrival of reinforcements under General Joseph E. Johnston from the Shenandoah Valley turned the tide. On Henry House Hill, a stern Virginia officer named Thomas Jonathan Jackson earned his immortal nickname Stonewall. His brigade stood firm against the assault, rallying Southern troops to counterattack. The Union line broke under confusion and panic, retreating toward Washington in chaos. Civilians fled alongside soldiers, and the road north became a river of dust and despair. The Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, as the South called it, shattered the illusion of a short war. Nearly 5,000 men were dead or wounded. Both governments realized the truth. This would be a long, brutal struggle requiring total commitment. The South rejoiced, but Davis warned that victory would demand more than bravery. It would require endurance. In the North, shame and shock hardened into resolve. Lincoln replaced McDowell with Major General George B. McClellan, a young officer whose organizational genius transformed the Army of the Potomac into a disciplined force. Yet McClellan's caution and perfectionism would soon prove both a blessing and a curse. While armies formed in the East, a new theater emerged in the West. Control of the Mississippi River was vital. Whoever held it could split the enemy's territory in two. In February 1862, a little-known Union officer named Ulysses S. Grant began his rise to prominence. His victories at Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Tennessee secured key waterways and forced the Confederates to retreat southward. No terms except unconditional surrender. Grant declared a phrase that made him a Northern hero. In April 1862, his army met Confederate forces at Shiloh, a brutal two-day battle on the banks of the Tennessee River. More than 23,000 men were killed or wounded. The scale of carnage shocked the nation. Shiloh ended any remaining hope that courage alone could win the day. At sea, the Union Navy enforced a blockade along the southern coast, part of General Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan to suffocate the Confederacy's trade and cut off supplies. Shipyards from Boston to Philadelphia worked night and day, launching gunboats and ironclads. The South countered with privateers and blockade runners, fast ships that slipped through with British goods. Yet, over time, the blockade tightened, starving southern cities and crippling their economy. In March 1862, the world witnessed a new era of naval warfare. At Hampton Roads, Virginia, two ironclad warships met in combat, the Union USS Monitor and the Confederate CSS Virginia, rebuilt from the captured USS Merrimack. For hours, the iron monsters battered each other with cannon fire that bounced harmlessly off their armored hulls. Though the battle ended indecisively, it signaled the end of wooden warships forever. As 1862 wore on, Lincoln began to see the war's deeper meaning. Initially, his goal was to restore the Union, not to abolish slavery outright. But the conflict itself began to redefine its purpose. Enslaved people, hearing of Union advances, fled plantations and sought refuge behind Northern lines. They became contraband of war, and their labor began to support the Union cause. Abolitionists pressed Lincoln to make emancipation an official goal. In the East, McClellan's Grand Peninsula Campaign aimed to capture Richmond by moving up the Virginia Peninsula. But his caution, coupled with Confederate resistance led by General Robert E. Lee, ended the campaign in failure. Lee, newly commanding the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, proved a master of maneuver and audacity. His victories at the 7 Days battles drove the Union back, transforming him into a Southern hero. The summer of 1862 saw renewed Confederate confidence. Lee carried the war into the North for the first time, seeking to win foreign recognition and demoralize Northern citizens. His army crossed the Potomac into Maryland, leading to one of the most significant battles in American history, the Battle of Antietam. On September 17, 1862, the fields near Sharpsburg erupted in slaughter. It was the bloodiest single day in American history, over 22,000 casualties in 12 hours. From dawn to dusk, the cornfield, the sunken road, and Burnside's bridge became killing grounds. The Union held the field but failed to destroy Lee's army. Yet strategically, Antietam was enough. Lee's invasion was halted, and Lincoln seized the moment. 5 days later, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in rebelling states would be free as of January 1, 1863. The war, once fought to preserve the Union, now carried a moral mission: to destroy slavery itself. This shift changed everything. The Confederacy could no longer hope for recognition from Britain or France, whose publics opposed slavery. The Union cause now resonated as a struggle for human freedom, giving moral force to its fight. For African Americans, both free and enslaved, the proclamation became a beacon. Thousands enlisted in the Union Army, transforming the conflict into a revolutionary crusade for liberty. By the end of 1862, both sides had learned that the Civil War was not a contest of weeks, nor even months. It was a war of total transformation. The old America had already died at Bull Run and Shiloh. A new one was being forged in blood and fire. Soldiers no longer spoke of going home by Christmas. They wrote instead of brothers buried, towns burned, and a future uncertain but inevitable. The year 1863 dawned over a nation exhausted yet unbroken. 2 years of war had turned idealists into veterans and transformed political speeches into long casualty lists. The countryside from Pennsylvania to Mississippi had become a graveyard. The new year brought a new declaration on January 1st, 1863, when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation into law. With a single act, the war's moral compass shifted forever. It declared that all enslaved people in the rebelling states were free. Though limited in immediate effect, the proclamation redefined the Union's cause and gave every battle a higher meaning. No longer was the war simply about preserving the Union. It had become a struggle for the freedom of millions. Across the South, word spread among the enslaved, whispered at night, carried by rumor and hope that the president had set them free. Many risked their lives to reach Union lines, and those who could fight joined the United States colored troops, determined to win their own liberation with their own hands. The war was transforming from within. In the West, Ulysses S. Grant continued his campaign to control the Mississippi River. The city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, stood as the last Confederate fortress on the river, commanding the trade routes of the interior. For months, Grant maneuvered his army through swamps, rivers, and hostile terrain, seeking to surround the city. The siege of Vicksburg began in May 1863. Confederate soldiers and civilians endured 4. On July 4, 1863, after a relentless assault and hunger, the Confederate garrison surrendered. The fall of Vicksburg gave the Union full control of the Mississippi and split the Confederacy in two. Grant's victory marked a turning point in the war, earning him national fame and Lincoln's growing trust. For the South, it was a wound from which recovery would prove impossible. Yet, even as Vicksburg fell in the West, the most decisive clash of the entire war was unfolding in the East. General Robert E. Lee, confident after his victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, sought once again to carry the fight into northern soil. His army of over 70,000 men crossed into Pennsylvania, hoping to force a peace or gain foreign recognition. The Army of the Potomac, under its new commander, General George G. Meade, moved to intercept. The two armies met near a quiet Pennsylvania town, Gettysburg, on July 1, 1863. The meeting was accidental at first, sparked by Confederate troops searching for supplies. But by noon, both sides were pouring reinforcements into the rolling hills and ridges around the town. For 3 days, the largest battle ever fought on American soil raged across the fields and valleys. On the first day, Confederate forces drove Union troops back through the town to the high ground south of Gettysburg Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. Meade's army entrenched on these slopes, forming a strong defensive line. On July 2nd, Lee attacked both flanks in an attempt to dislodge them. The fighting was savage. Places like Little Round Top, Devil's Den, and the Wheatfield became names etched into legend. Union Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his 20th Maine Regiment held their position on Little Round Top with desperate courage, repelling repeated Confederate assaults and finally charging with bayonets when their ammunition ran dry. The third day brought Lee's fateful gamble. Believing the Union center weakened, he ordered Pickett's charge, a frontal assault by 12,500 men across open ground under withering artillery and rifle fire. For nearly an hour, Confederate soldiers marched through a storm of shot and shell toward the Union line. Only a handful reached the stone wall at the top of Cemetery Ridge before being repelled or captured. The charge collapsed, and with it, the Confederate hope for victory in the North. Lee's army retreated south, shattered but not destroyed. Gettysburg and Vicksburg, falling within a single day of each other, marked the high tide of the Confederacy. Never again would Southern forces seriously threaten Northern soil. The losses were staggering, over 50,000 casualties combined, and the psychological blow immense. Yet, even in defeat, Lee's army fought on with grim determination. The war was far from over. As summer turned to autumn, the human cost grew unbearable. Fields once rich with wheat now bore the bones of men. In towns from Richmond to New York, black-clad widows filled the streets. Lincoln, feeling the weight of so much death, traveled to the site of the Gettysburg battlefield in November 1863 to dedicate a national cemetery. The speech he gave that day, lasting barely 2 minutes, became immortal. For 47 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address reframed the war once more not merely as a struggle for territory, but as a test of whether democracy itself could survive such division. The words were simple, yet they cut through despair like light through smoke. Meanwhile, in Tennessee, the war's momentum continued to shift. In late 1863, Confederate forces besieged the Union Army at Chattanooga, hoping to regain control of the region. Reinforcements under Grant broke the siege in November, storming the Confederate lines at Missionary Ridge and driving them south. This victory opened the road to the Deep South, setting the stage for a new campaign, one that would burn the heart of the Confederacy. Grant's success earned him promotion to General-in-Chief of all Union armies. Lincoln, impressed by his determination, brought him east to confront Lee directly. For the first time, the Union's vast strength would be coordinated under a single command. In early 1864, Grant began planning a relentless offensive designed to grind down the Confederate forces through continuous pressure, a strategy of total war. But before that great campaign began, another transformation unfolded quietly in the ranks. Black soldiers, once denied the right to fight, now made up nearly 10% of the Union Army. At Fort Wagner in South Carolina, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, one of the first African-American units, attacked the Confederate defenses in July 1863. Though the assault failed and their colonel, Robert Gould Shaw, was killed, their bravery proved beyond doubt that black soldiers could fight and die for the same cause as any other. Their sacrifice gave living proof of the Emancipation Proclamation's promise. While armies clashed in open battle, politics and diplomacy worked in the background. The Confederacy's hope for foreign intervention dwindled as the Union victories mounted and the moral tide turned. European nations watched the conflict closely but refused to recognize the South. Britain, once sympathetic due to its textile interests, turned away after the Emancipation Proclamation made the war synonymous with the fight against slavery. By the close of 1863, the Confederacy's strength was waning. Its currency collapsed, inflation soared, and food shortages spread across the South. Desperation led to bread riots in Richmond and other cities as women and children demanded food. In contrast, the Union economy boomed, fueled by industry and immigration. Yet even in the North, war weariness grew. Draft riots erupted in New York City in July 1863 as poor immigrants protested conscription laws they believed favored the wealthy. The riots turned violent, targeting black citizens and government buildings, revealing that even among the victors, unity was fragile. In the winter camps, soldiers on both sides endured hunger, disease, and the endless wait between battles. Letters home spoke of frostbite, lice, and the silence of fallen friends. The war was consuming an entire generation. Yet, the Union Army now marched with renewed conviction. The twin victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg had turned despair into belief. The Union was winning not yet in territory, but in resolve. As 1863 ended, the course of the war had changed forever. The Confederacy had lost its chance for foreign aid, its armies had been beaten in the field, and its people were starving. But it had not yet lost its will. The next year would bring the most relentless fighting of all battles that would stretch from Virginia's forests to the sea, led by men who now understood that peace could come only when one side could fight no more. The war that began with speeches of glory was now a grim test of endurance. The idealism of 1861 was gone. The fire of revolution had turned into the cold steel of necessity. Every man, woman, and child in America felt the weight of a conflict that had become larger than politics or pride. The Union and the Confederacy were no longer simply fighting for victory. They were fighting for survival and for the right to define what America would mean when the smoke finally cleared. In the dark corridors of the White House in late 1862, Abraham Lincoln paced restlessly. The weight of a divided nation hung heavy on his shoulders. For nearly 2 years, he had struggled to balance compassion with command, law with morality, and the preservation of the Union with the freedom of 4 million enslaved souls. The war, once framed as a political conflict to preserve the Union, had revealed its true nature. It was about slavery. Every battle, every speech, every desperate negotiation circled back to that unspoken truth. Lincoln knew that to heal the nation, he would first have to tear out its deepest wound. The spark came from the aftermath of Antietam. Though neither side had claimed a decisive victory on that September day in 1862, the Confederate retreat gave Lincoln the confidence to act. He had already drafted a proclamation declaring freedom for the enslaved and rebelling states. But he had waited. He could not risk appearing desperate after a defeat. Now, with the Union standing firm, he saw his moment. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It warned that unless the Confederate States laid down their arms and returned to the Union by January 1, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state shall be then thenceforward and forever free. The South ignored the ultimatum. The war raged on, but on January 1, 1863, under a pale winter sky, Lincoln signed the final Emancipation Proclamation. The room was silent except for the scratching of his pen. As he finished, his hand trembled slightly. "If my name ever goes into history," he said quietly, "it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." The document did not free a single slave in the loyal border states, nor those already under Union control. But its power lay in principle, not geography. For the first time, the United States officially declared that human freedom was a war aim. The moral ground of the conflict shifted. The Union now fought not just to preserve itself, but to redefine itself. The response was electric. Across the North, abolitionists rejoiced. Church bells rang in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. In the South, enslaved people whispered the news in the fields, some escaping at night toward Union lines, guided by the faint hope that the president's words would soon become reality. For them, the proclamation was not a piece of paper, it was a promise that the old world of chains and auctions was beginning to crumble. The Confederacy, however, saw the proclamation as proof that Lincoln intended to destroy their society completely. Southern newspapers denounced him as a tyrant, and Confederate leaders swore never to surrender to an army that sought to free their slaves. What Lincoln had done was revolutionary. He had turned a political war into a moral crusade. The conflict could no longer end in compromise. One side would have to be remade entirely. The Emancipation Proclamation also changed the Union Army. For the first time, African American men were invited to enlist. The call was answered with overwhelming courage. Over the next 2 years, nearly 180,000 black soldiers and sailors joined the fight, forming more than 160 regiments. Many had escaped from bondage themselves. Others had waited generations for the chance to fight for liberty. Their service transformed the moral balance of the war. The struggle for freedom was now being fought by those who had been denied it the longest. Among the earliest of these units was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. On July 18, 1863, they led a heroic assault on Fort Wagner, South Carolina, facing withering fire from entrenched Confederate guns. Nearly half the regiment was killed or wounded. Though the fort did not fall, their bravery silenced critics who doubted the courage of black troops. Newspapers across the North carried their story, inspiring thousands more to enlist. Lincoln would later call their service one of the most powerful arguments for emancipation itself. But emancipation was not only a battlefield measure. It became a weapon of diplomacy. The Confederacy had long hoped for recognition from Britain or France, nations whose industries depended on Southern cotton. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, the calculus changed. European powers could not openly support a nation founded on slavery. In London and Paris, public opinion turned against the South. The war was now clearly a struggle between freedom and bondage. The Confederacy stood alone. Within the Union, the proclamation gave the Northern cause new moral fire, but it also deepened division. Not all Northerners welcomed the new policy. Racism ran deep, even among those who opposed secession. Critics accused Lincoln of turning the war into an abolitionist crusade that would prolong the fighting. In July 1863, when the federal government introduced a military draft, protests erupted in New York City. For 4 days, mobs rioted through the streets, burning buildings and attacking black citizens. The violence left more than 100 people dead. The riots revealed an uncomfortable truth. While the nation fought to end slavery, many in the North still struggled to accept racial equality. Lincoln himself faced immense political risk. In the coming election, he feared losing support from moderates in border states. But he stood firm. "I never, in my life," he said, "felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper." His leadership was not that of a radical agitator, but of a man who had been forced by history to evolve. Through tragedy and necessity, Lincoln's moral vision had expanded to match the magnitude of the war. The proclamation also transformed the psychology of the enslaved. Wherever Union troops advanced, thousands fled from plantations, seeking freedom behind Northern lines. These contrabands, as they were called, often lived in camps near Union encampments, working, learning to read, and in many cases, joining the army. For the first time, African Americans began to play an active role in reshaping the future of the country. Freedom was no longer an abstract idea. It was being built by those who had been enslaved. By the end of 1863, emancipation had become an irreversible fact. The Confederacy could never return to the Union with slavery intact. The war, therefore, could have only one end, not merely reunion, but transformation. The institution that had defined and divided America since its founding was now dying on the battlefield. Every Union victory brought liberation to thousands more. Every Confederate defeat meant the collapse of an old order. Lincoln's personal journey mirrored the nation's. The man who had once insisted that his only goal was to save the Union had come to see that the Union itself could not survive half slave and half free. "In giving freedom to the slave," he wrote, "we assure freedom to the free." It was an acknowledgement that the war was purging America of its original and that out of the ashes, a new nation might emerge. Still, emancipation did not bring immediate peace. The war intensified. Confederate armies fought with renewed desperation, knowing that defeat now meant social and economic ruin. The South's leaders called Lincoln's proclamation an invitation to servile insurrection, warning of chaos and bloodshed. Yet, instead of rebellion, the enslaved people showed resilience and faith. They fled, they worked, and they waited, knowing that the world was changing beyond recognition. In the North, the presence of black soldiers altered the very image of the war. Newspapers published photographs of men in blue uniforms, rifles in hand, their eyes fixed not on slavery, but on citizenship. The old myth that freedom belonged only to a few was being dismantled in real time. In battlefields from Port Hudson to Petersburg, these men fought not for abstract politics, but for the simple, sacred idea that they were human beings. By early 1864, the Emancipation Proclamation had become more than a policy. It was the soul of the Union war effort. It redefined what victory meant. No peace without freedom. No union without equality. Lincoln's vision had changed the trajectory of history. He had taken a divided republic and given it a cause larger than itself. The world was watching. Across the Atlantic, the poet John Bright wrote that Lincoln had struck a blow that will be remembered by history long after all traces of the present war are effaced. And within the United States, that blow reverberated through every field, every home, every battlefield where freedom and death met face to face. By transforming the war from a political struggle into a moral reckoning, Lincoln had changed the destiny of his country. The nation that had begun the war, divided by race and bound by slavery, was now fighting for an idea that freedom was the right of all. The cost of that idea would be immense, but in the fires of 1863, it had been set beyond undoing. The year 1863 would become the fulcrum upon which the entire American Civil War turned. For 2 long years, the Confederacy had held its ground, defying the Union's industrial might with fierce determination and brilliant generals. Yet by midsummer, the tide began to shift not through a single victory, but through a series of relentless blows that reshaped the war's destiny. It was the year of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, twin turning points that would define the fate of a nation divided. As spring turned to summer, the Confederacy's hope burned with one man's confidence, General Robert E. Lee. His victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville had stunned the North. At Chancellorsville, he had defeated a Union army twice his size, though at the terrible cost of losing his most trusted commander, Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson, who was accidentally shot by his own men. Jackson's death in May 1863 shook Lee deeply. "He has lost his left arm," Lee said of his fallen general, "but I have lost my right." Yet despite grief and exhaustion, Lee pressed forward. Believing the Union was demoralized and divided, he devised a bold plan to invade the North again, striking into Pennsylvania. Such a move, he hoped, would relieve pressure on Virginia's war-torn farms, gather supplies from the rich northern countryside, and perhaps force Lincoln into peace negotiations. Lee also understood the political stakes. A Confederate victory on Union soil might convince Britain or France to recognize the South as an independent nation. In June 1863, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, 75,000 strong, marched north through the Shenandoah Valley. Their boots raised clouds of dust along the mountain roads as they crossed the Potomac River. Meanwhile, the Union Army of the Potomac, recently placed under the command of General George G. Meade, hurried north to intercept them. By late June, both armies converged on a small Pennsylvania town called Gettysburg, a crossroads surrounded by rolling farmland and low ridges. On July 1st, 1863, advance units from both sides collided unexpectedly west of town. What began as a skirmish for supplies quickly escalated into a full-scale battle. The first day saw Confederate forces drive Union troops back through Gettysburg itself, forcing them to retreat to the high ground south of town, Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. The Union line, shaped like a fishhook, offered strong defensive ground. That night, Lee faced a choice: withdraw and wait for the Union to attack, or press forward and crush them before reinforcements arrived. he chose to attack. On July 2nd, Lee launched assaults on both Union flanks. To the south, fierce fighting erupted at Little Round Top, Devil's Den, and the Wheatfield. Union Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and the 20th Maine Regiment held the extreme left of the line. When their ammunition ran low, Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet charge down the hill, catching the Confederates by surprise and saving the Union flank. To the north, Confederate General Richard Ewell attacked Cemetery Hill but was repelled after brutal hand-to-hand fighting. As darkness fell, thousands lay dead or dying across the fields. The cries of the wounded filled the night air, men calling for water, for comrades, for God. The next day, July 3rd, Lee made his most fateful decision. Believing the Union center weakened, he ordered General George Pickett and his division to attack directly across an open field nearly a mile wide. At 3 p.m., after a thunderous artillery barrage, 12,500 Confederate soldiers stepped forward in perfect lines, marching toward the Union position on Cemetery Ridge. For half an hour, they advanced under a storm of cannon and musket fire. Whole ranks fell with each volley. When they reached the stone wall at the ridge's crest, Union defenders poured fire into their flanks. The charge collapsed under its own bravery. Pickett's division was shattered. Over half of his men were killed, wounded, or captured. Lee rode out to meet the survivors and said softly, "It is all my fault." The Battle of Gettysburg was over. Lee's army retreated on July 4th, the same day that, far to the south, another Confederate stronghold fell, Vicksburg, Mississippi. For months, Union General Ulysses S. Grant had laid siege to Vicksburg, the last Confederate fortress controlling the Mississippi River. His army surrounded the city in May 1863, cutting off supplies and bombarding it day and night. Inside the city, residents dug caves into the hillsides to escape the shells. They lived on mule meat and rats as starvation set in. Confederate soldiers, their uniforms in rags, fought with fading strength. On July 4th, 1863, after 47 days, Confederate General John C. Pemberton surrendered to Grant. The victory gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. From that day on, the South could no longer move men or supplies freely between its eastern and western halves. The dual victories of Gettysburg and Vicksburg transformed the war. The Confederate dream of invading the North died at Gettysburg, and the Confederacy itself was cut in half at Vicksburg. For the Union, the momentum finally shifted. Lincoln, upon hearing of Grant's triumph, exclaimed, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." Yet the cost was unimaginable. Gettysburg alone claimed more than 51,000 casualties, the largest battle ever fought in North America. Thousands of bodies lay unburied under the July sun. The air was thick with the stench of death. The fields around the small Pennsylvania town were forever changed. In November 1863, 4 months later, Abraham Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a national cemetery on the site of the battlefield. The ceremony was brief. The main speaker, Edward Everett, spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln spoke for barely 2 minutes. But his Gettysburg address would outlive every speech of the war. 47 years ago, he began, recalling the founding of the nation. In just 272 words, Lincoln redefined the meaning of the conflict. The war, he said, was not merely for the Union's survival, but for the principle that all men are created equal. The dead had not fallen in vain if the nation could achieve a new birth of freedom. Those words transformed sacrifice into purpose. Across the country, Lincoln's speech echoed in hearts that had begun to falter. War weariness had gripped the North. Enlistments had fallen. Criticism of Lincoln's leadership grew sharper. But Gettysburg and Vicksburg rekindled the belief that the Union cause was not only just but winnable. In the South, despair began to seep through the cracks of confidence. Soldiers deserted in growing numbers, their families starving at home. Inflation devoured wages. Confederate currency became nearly worthless. The rich still dined well in Richmond, but in the countryside, women led bread riots, demanding food for their children. Meanwhile, in Tennessee, Grant's forces pushed deeper into Confederate territory, capturing Chattanooga in November 1863. The victory opened the gateway to Georgia and the Deep South. Lincoln promoted Grant to command all Union armies, trusting his relentless drive to bring the war to an end. For the Confederacy, 1863 marked the beginning of the end. Lee's army would fight on valiantly for 2 more years, but never again would it have the strength to invade the North. The dream of foreign recognition vanished. The South's hope of independence began to die not in a single moment, but in the slow, grinding realization that courage could not overcome exhaustion. And yet, even as the Confederacy weakened, the war was far from finished. The North had learned through bitter experience that victory in battle did not mean peace. Each triumph brought new challenges, supply lines to maintain, captured cities to govern, and a divided public to reassure. For Lincoln, the task grew heavier by the day. He had freed the slaves in Confederate territory, but he knew that true freedom required more than proclamations. It would demand the reconstruction of a shattered country and the redefinition of citizenship itself. But those struggles lay ahead, in a future still uncertain. For now, the year 1863 stood as a hinge of fate. Before it, the Confederacy had seemed invincible. After it, its downfall became inevitable. The Union armies had learned to fight as one, guided by commanders who finally understood the scale of what was required. The war was evolving from a conflict of strategy to one of endurance, from politics to survival. In the smoke-filled fields of Gettysburg, the nation had glimpsed both its darkest moment and its possible redemption. Thousands lay buried beneath the soil, their names unknown, their blood mingled with the earth of the country they had fought to define. Above them, Lincoln's words would endure, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. By the close of 1863, the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The Union held the advantage, but the road ahead promised no mercy. The South would fight on, fierce and unyielding, clinging to its cause with the last of its strength. The North, now united by purpose, would press forward with a new kind of war, one that sought not only victory, but transformation. The American Civil War had crossed its midpoint. What began as a rebellion had become a revolution, one that would either destroy the Union forever or remake it into something stronger than it had ever been before. By early 1864, the war had reached a grim stalemate. The Union had gained the upper hand, strategically controlling the Mississippi River and blocking the southern ports, but victory was still far away. Every mile gained in the South was paid for in blood. The North had more men, more factories, and more railroads, yet the Confederacy fought with an endurance that defied exhaustion. Both sides were now engaged in a war not of quick battles, but of attrition. It had become a contest of endurance of who could bear the suffering longer. In March 1864, Abraham Lincoln made the most decisive appointment of the war. He called Ulysses S. Grant to Washington and placed him in command of all Union armies. Grant was no stranger to hardship. From his early failures in business and the army, he had risen through relentless determination. His victories at Fort Donelson, Shiloh, and Vicksburg had earned him Lincoln's trust. Unlike his predecessors, Grant did not rely on elaborate maneuvers or constant retreats. His strategy was simple: to destroy the Confederate armies, wherever they stood, by continuous pressure until they broke. Grant understood that the Confederacy could not survive an endless war. He planned a coordinated assault across all fronts. While he personally led the Army of the Potomac against Lee in Virginia, General William Tecumseh Sherman would march into Georgia to crush the South's industrial and psychological heart. Smaller armies under generals like Benjamin Butler, Nathaniel Banks, and Franz Sigel would strike elsewhere to stretch the Confederate lines thin. When Grant arrived at the Union headquarters in Virginia, he was met by the weary eyes of soldiers who had seen generals come and go. He made his headquarters not in Washington, but in the field, close to his men, signaling that this war would be fought shoulder to shoulder. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," he wrote to Lincoln. It would take far longer than that. On May 4th, 1864, Grant crossed the Rapidan River, beginning what would be known as the Overland Campaign, a brutal series of battles that would grind both armies to exhaustion. The first clash came in the tangled undergrowth of the wilderness, a dense forest where visibility was low and the air thick with gunpowder. On May 5th and 6th, Lee struck hard, using the terrain to his advantage. Fires ignited by gunfire swept through the woods, consuming the wounded where they lay. Men burned alive in the brush while the forest echoed with their screams. After 2 days of savage fighting, neither side held a clear victory. Grant had lost nearly 18,000 men, but instead of retreating as other Union generals had done, he moved south toward Spotsylvania Courthouse. At Spotsylvania, from May 8th to May 21st, the slaughter continued. For nearly 2 weeks, men fought in trenches and mud, charging across open ground into withering fire. The Bloody Angle, a section of the Confederate line, became a vision of hell. Rain turned the earth to crimson sludge as soldiers fought hand-to-hand for hours. Bayonets, rifle butts, and even bare fists were used when ammunition ran out. Grant refused to give up. Each time Lee blocked his path, the Union Army sidestepped south, forcing the Confederates to follow. The war had become a slow, grinding movement toward Richmond, the Confederate capital. On June 3, 1864, at Cold Harbor, Grant made his most costly mistake. Believing Lee's defenses were weaker than they were, he ordered a frontal assault. In less than an hour, 7,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded. Many pinned slips of paper to their backs with their names, knowing they would die. Even Grant, hardened by war, was shaken. "I have always regretted that last assault at Cold Harbor," he later admitted. Yet he did not turn back. Instead, he crossed the James River and began the siege of Petersburg, a key railroad hub south of Richmond. There, the armies dug in for months of trench warfare, a grim preview of the modern wars to come. While Grant locked Lee in Virginia, far to the west, Sherman began his campaign through Georgia. His goal was Atlanta, the industrial heart of the Confederacy. Sherman's army of 100,000 men moved out from Chattanooga in May 1864, facing Confederate forces under General Joseph E. Johnston. Johnston fought a cautious, delaying campaign, retreating gradually toward Atlanta, hoping to wear Sherman down. But Confederate President Jefferson Davis, impatient with Johnston's retreat, replaced him with the aggressive John Bell Hood. Hood launched a series of reckless attacks that cost him thousands of men. Sherman, avoiding confrontation, used flanking maneuvers to tighten his grip on Atlanta. On September 2, 1864, Union forces entered the city. The capture of Atlanta electrified the North. After years of frustration, the Union finally had a victory that felt decisive. Lincoln, facing re-election that November, had been losing public support. War weariness, casualties, and political opposition had left many calling for peace. His opponent, former Union General George B. McClellan, ran on a platform that hinted at negotiation with the South. But Sherman's victory in Atlanta transformed the mood overnight. Northern newspapers declared that the war could now be won. Lincoln won re-election in a landslide. His second term would be dedicated to ending the war and reuniting the nation. In his victory speech, he declared, "We shall nobly save, or meanly lose, the last best hope of earth." The people had chosen to see the war through. After securing Atlanta, Sherman made his most controversial decision to march his army across Georgia to the sea. His orders were clear: break the South's will to fight by destroying its infrastructure and supplies. He called it hard war. Civilians would not be killed, but their resources would be taken or destroyed. From November to December 1864, Sherman's troops cut a swath through Georgia 60 miles wide, burning railroads, crops, and factories. They tore up railway lines, heating and twisting the rails into Sherman's neckties. Towns fell one by one as his men lived off the land. Slaves, hearing that Union troops were near, fled plantations to follow the army in the hope of freedom. By the time Sherman reached Savannah, Georgia, on December 21, 1864, the Confederacy was bleeding to death. He telegraphed Lincoln, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift to the city of Savannah." Meanwhile, in Virginia, Grant's siege of Petersburg dragged into winter. The trenches stretched for miles, filled with cold, hungry men. Disease spread through the camps. Both armies were nearly at their breaking point, yet neither commander would yield. For Lee, the situation was desperate. His army was shrinking, desertions increased daily, and supplies were nearly gone. Confederate civilians starved as Union forces tightened the blockade. Richmond itself trembled under threat. Still, Lee refused to surrender. He hoped that if he could hold out long enough, Northern morale might collapse or Lincoln might be forced into negotiation. But by 1865, those hopes were fading fast. The Confederacy was collapsing from within. Inflation made Confederate money worthless. Railroads lay in ruins. Slaves escaped by the thousands to Union lines. And the promise of freedom, once distant, was now a living reality for many. The Union strategy had worked. Grant and Sherman's combined pressure left the South trapped in a tightening vice. Every Confederate victory now seemed to delay the inevitable, not reverse it. The war that began with optimism and flags flying had become a war of exhaustion, fought by men whose only remaining purpose was to see it end. By early spring, the end was near. Richmond, the proud capital of the Confederacy, stood on the brink. Sherman, having marched through Georgia, was now moving north through the Carolinas to link up with Grant. The South was being crushed from both sides, and as Lee's men held their lines at Petersburg, thin and starving, they must have felt the weight of the entire war pressing down on them. The once great army of Northern Virginia that had marched in triumph into Pennsylvania was now reduced to fragmentary, weary soldiers in tattered gray, holding on not for victory, but for honor. In those final months, the Confederacy still fought fiercely, but the outcome was already written in the blood-soaked soil of Virginia and Georgia. The long night of war was nearing its end. What began in 1861 as a fight for independence had become, by 1865, a desperate struggle for survival. The Union had endured. The Confederacy was dying. The question that remained was not whether the war would end, but how much more it would destroy before peace could return to a broken nation. By the dawn of 1864, the American Civil War had become a war of endurance, a slow, grinding struggle that neither side could easily escape. The quick victories both North and South had once dreamed of were gone. Cities had been razed, farms ruined, and families torn apart. Yet even in its fourth year, the war showed no sign of mercy. The South still believed in independence. The North was determined to restore the Union. It was at this turning point that Ulysses S. Grant, the quiet, relentless general from the West, stepped fully into history. Lincoln had placed his faith in him after so many disappointments with other commanders. Grant's mind was unyielding, focused not on one great battle, but on the destruction of Confederate resistance. When he took command of all Union forces in March 1864, he knew that victory would not come from clever maneuvers or sudden strikes, but from relentless pressure. The Confederacy, he reasoned, could not survive a war of attrition. If the Union Army struck everywhere at once on all fronts, at all times, the South would finally collapse. Grant's headquarters were with the Army of the Potomac under General George Meade, though it was Grant who directed every major movement. His eyes were fixed on Robert E. Lee, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee remained the Confederacy's greatest hope, a general of unmatched skill and reputation, capable of turning disadvantage into victory. Grant knew that as long as Lee's army stood, the Confederacy could still fight. His task was simple and terrible: destroy it. In early May, Grant began his overland campaign, one of the bloodiest series of operations in military history. His army crossed the Rapidan River into Virginia, entering the tangled wilderness, a dense forest that muffled artillery and turned battle into chaos. On May 5, 1864, Lee's forces struck suddenly, igniting 2 days of brutal fighting. Flames leapt through the underbrush, setting the forest ablaze. Soldiers, unable to see more than a few yards, fired blindly into the smoke. Wounded men burned alive where they fell. The air stank of gunpowder and flesh. When the smoke cleared, Grant had lost more than 17,000 men, Lee about 11,000. The Union Army had been mauled, but Grant did not retreat. For the first time, a Union general refused to turn back after facing Lee. He simply moved south, writing, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." To the exhausted troops, those words became a grim promise that the war would not end until one side broke completely. The next clash came at Spotsylvania Courthouse, where for nearly 2 weeks the two armies fought over a few square miles of muddy Virginia soil, trenches filled with water and blood. At a place later known as the Bloody Angle, soldiers fought hand-to-hand for more than 20 hours. Muskets were fired so rapidly that trees as thick as a man's waist were cut down by bullets alone. When night finally fell, the ground was covered in bodies so dense that one could walk across the field without touching earth. Grant continued his advance south, always pushing Lee toward Richmond, the Confederate capital. At Cold Harbor in early June, Grant ordered another direct assault, a mistake that cost 7,000 Union lives in less than an hour. The dead lay so close to the Confederate lines that their bodies could not be retrieved for days. Many Union soldiers had written their names and home addresses on slips of paper pinned to their coats, knowing they would not survive. Despite the losses, Grant refused to quit. The press called him a butcher, but Lincoln defended him, saying, "I can't spare this man. He fights." And fight he did. He crossed the James River, bypassing Richmond to strike at Petersburg, a vital supply hub. There, the armies dug in, beginning a siege that would last nearly 10 months, a grim prelude to modern trench warfare. Meanwhile, far to the west, General William Tecumseh Sherman, Grant's closest ally, was carrying out the other half of the plan. Sherman had captured Atlanta in September 1864, a triumph that revived Northern morale and helped secure Lincoln's re-election. Now, with the Confederacy reeling, Sherman prepared to march across Georgia toward the Atlantic Ocean. His plan was revolutionary and devastating. He would cut loose from his supply lines and march through the heart of the South, destroying anything that could sustain the Confederate war effort. This was not a mere battle. It was psychological warfare. He wanted to break the South's will to fight. From November to December 1864, Sherman's army of 60,000 men carved a path of destruction 60 miles wide, burning crops, tearing up railroads, and seizing livestock. "We are not only fighting armies," Sherman declared, "but a hostile people." His soldiers twisted railroad tracks into loops called Sherman's neckties, and left a scorched path that terrified the Confederacy. To many Southerners, it was a vision of apocalypse. To many Northerners, it was the turning of the tide. When Sherman reached Savannah on December 21st, he telegraphed Lincoln with a simple message: "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." The South's heart had been cut open. By early 1865, Lee's army at Petersburg was starving. Supplies were scarce, morale was low, and desertions grew by the day. Confederate civilians, once confident in victory, now faced famine. Inflation made Confederate money worthless, and the blockade choked the ports. Still, Lee refused to surrender. He believed that if his army could hold out long enough, perhaps Northern resolve would falter, or foreign powers might intervene. Grant would not allow it. Through the long winter of 1864 to 65, he tightened the siege. The Union armies cut the last rail lines feeding Richmond. In March, at Fort Stedman, Lee launched a desperate counterattack, his final gamble. For a brief moment, his troops broke through the Union lines, but Grant quickly countered, and the attack collapsed. Lee's army was finished. On April 2, 1865, Grant broke through the defenses at Petersburg. Richmond, the proud capital of the Confederacy, fell the next day. Fires consumed warehouses and arsenals as Confederate officials fled. President Jefferson Davis escaped southward, refusing to admit defeat. Lee's army retreated west, hoping to reach supplies near Appomattox Station. Grant pursued relentlessly. Hungry, exhausted, and surrounded, Lee finally saw the truth. To continue fighting would mean the destruction of his arm and the pointless death of thousands more men. On April 9, 1865, Lee met Grant at a small farmhouse in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Grant arrived in a mud-stained uniform, Lee in his finest dress coat. The two men, adversaries for nearly a year, spoke quietly and respectfully. Grant offered generous terms. Confederate officers could keep their sidearms, and soldiers could return home with their horses. There would be no trials, no executions. Lee signed the papers. The Army of Northern Virginia was no more. As he rode away, Union soldiers lined the road. None cheered. They simply watched in silence, some even saluting their defeated foe. The war that had torn the nation apart was ending, not in triumph or vengeance, but in exhaustion and relief. When word of the surrender reached the Union camps, soldiers wept and embraced. Some knelt in prayer. The guns that had thundered for 4 years finally fell silent. Lincoln, upon hearing the news, simply said, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again." In those few moments at Appomattox, a shattered nation began to heal. Yet beneath the relief lay a haunting truth. More than 620,000 Americans had died, and millions more had been left grieving. The South was in ruins. Cities burned, railroads twisted, and entire generations of young men were gone. Grant, the general who had fought relentlessly for victory, refused to celebrate. When his troops began to cheer, he stopped them. "The war is over," he said softly. "The rebels are again our countrymen." In his quiet way, Grant had achieved what no other man could. Not just military victory, but mercy. The Civil War had ended as it had begun, fought between men who were once brothers, bound by a shared history and a divided heart. But even as peace began to settle over the weary land, one final tragedy waited in the shadow of the death of the man who had guided the Union through its darkest years. Within days, Abraham Lincoln would fall to an assassin's bullet, and the dream of reconciliation would face its greatest test. The nation had been preserved, but its soul, like its people, would take generations to mend. When General William Tecumseh Sherman looked out over the burning ruins of Atlanta in September 1864, he knew the war was entering a new phase. The South had lost its industrial heart, its major rail hub, and much of its hope. Yet its armies still fought on. Sherman believed that to end the war, the Union had to do more than defeat Confederate troops in battle. The South's will to fight its very capacity to sustain war had to be broken. What followed was one of the most audacious and controversial military campaigns in American history, Sherman's March to the Sea. The campaign would sever the remaining Confederate supply lines, spread fear throughout the South, and prove that resistance was futile. Sherman intended to make the Confederate heartland understand the true cost of rebellion. "We are not only fighting hostile armies," he wrote, "but a hostile people, and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war." On November 15, 1864, after ordering the evacuation of Atlanta, Sherman's army, 62,000 men divided into two wings, began its march east. Behind them, flames rose from the city as supply depots, rail lines, and armories were destroyed. The soldiers left Atlanta smoldering, the air thick with smoke and ash. They carried with them a few supplies. Instead, they would live off the land, taking what they needed and destroying what they could not use. The march covered roughly 15 miles a day, stretching across a 60-mile-wide front. Union soldiers tore up railroads, heated the iron rails over bonfires, and twisted them around trees into what they mockingly called Sherman's neckties. Cotton gins, mills, and warehouses went up in flames. Livestock was seized, cornfields trampled. Entire towns watched as blue-coated soldiers poured through, taking food, wagons, and horses. Sherman's orders were clear: destroy infrastructure, but spare civilians as much as possible. Yet in practice, the line between military necessity and vengeance blurred. For many Union soldiers, years of war and loss had hardened them. They saw the South not just as an enemy army, but as the source of all the bloodshed. Some looted homes, others burned plantations out of spite. Southern civilians, particularly plantation owners, faced the reality of war for the first time. Wealth, status, and defiance could not shield them from the march. At the same time, thousands of enslaved people saw the Union Army as a path to freedom. As Sherman's troops advanced, they were joined by streams of newly freed men, women, and children. Many followed the army on foot, carrying what little they owned, uncertain of what awaited them but unwilling to remain in bondage. The Union soldiers called them contrabands, human evidence of the war's moral dimension. For Sherman, these freed people were both a symbol of liberation and a logistical burden. His army could barely feed itself, and thousands of refugees followed in its wake. He established makeshift camps, but the suffering was immense. Yet their presence gave the march a moral weight that Sherman could not ignore. With each step toward the coast, the old order of the South, the world of slavery and plantation power, was being swept away. The Confederate response was weak and fragmented. General William J. Hardee commanded a small force tasked with slowing Sherman's advance, but he lacked the men and supplies to challenge him directly. Cavalry skirmishes flared along the route, but no major battle occurred. The Confederate High Command, desperate and disorganized, still hoped that Sherman might turn north toward Augusta or Macon, but he pressed steadily toward the Atlantic. By late November, the Union columns had reached Milledgeville, the capital of Georgia. Sherman's troops occupied the State House, where Union soldiers mockingly held a mock legislative session and symbolically repealed Georgia's secession. It was psychological warfare at its most effective, a deliberate humiliation of the Confederate cause. From Milledgeville, Sherman pushed southeast through swamps and rivers, crossing burned bridges and rutted roads. As the march continued, the destruction deepened. By December, the soldiers were entering the coastal plains, where rice plantations lined the rivers. The wealthy planters who had built their fortunes on slave labor fled as the Union Army approached. The enslaved workers, long denied freedom, celebrated their liberation. In some places, Union officers organized them into labor battalions or guides. In others, they simply joined the march, singing hymns that echoed across the night camps. Go down, Moses, and swing low, sweet chariot. On December 10, 1864, Sherman's forces reached the outskirts of Savannah, defended by Confederate General Hardee and a small garrison of around 10,000 men. Sherman surrounded the city, cutting off escape routes and bombardment supplies. Hardee, recognizing the futility of resistance, evacuated Savannah on December 20th, retreating across the Savannah River into South Carolina. The next morning, Union troops entered the city. To their surprise, Savannah was largely intact. Sherman, impressed by its beauty and order, spared it from destruction. On December 22nd, he sent a famous telegram to President Lincoln. I beg to present you as a Christmas gift to the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, also about 25,000 bales of cotton. Lincoln's reply was simple and heartfelt. Many thanks for your Christmas gift, the capture of Savannah. The march had achieved its purpose. The South was broken. Railroads lay in ruins. Its economy was crippled. Its people were demoralized. Confederate soldiers returning home found ashes where their farms once stood. Sherman's campaign had cut the Confederacy in two and shattered its illusion of invincibility. But Sherman was not finished. His next target lay north of South Carolina, the birthplace of secession. To many Union soldiers, this was the state most responsible for the war. Here is where treason began, one wrote, and by God, here is where it shall end. In January 1865, Sherman's army turned northward, crossing into South Carolina. The destruction there was even greater. The army's resentment against the state burned as fiercely as the fires they set. Columbia, the capital, was captured and largely destroyed by flames in February. Whether the fires were accidental or deliberate remains debated, but to the Southerners who watched their city burn, it felt like divine punishment. As Sherman advanced, the Confederate government crumbled. Communication lines collapsed. Food shortages became famine. Confederate soldiers deserted in droves, many returning home to protect their families. President Jefferson Davis fled southward, clinging to the last fragments of his failing nation. Meanwhile, Sherman's and Grant's forces moved closer together, the jaws of the Union war machine closing around Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia. By March 1865, Sherman had crossed into North Carolina, his men weary but unstoppable. Behind them lay hundreds of miles of destruction, but ahead lay the promise of peace. Sherman understood that his march would be remembered not only as a military triumph, but as a symbol of transformation. The destruction of the South's infrastructure was not mere punishment. It was the death of an old world, a world built on slavery, hierarchy, and rebellion. In its place, something new would be born, though painfully and imperfectly. In the towns his army left behind, freedmen began building lives of their own. Schools were opened, churches founded, and communities formed from the ashes. The cost had been enormous, but the moral purpose, the destruction of slavery and the rebirth of the Union, gave the suffering meaning. As the soldiers camped in Savannah that winter, they knew the end was near. The Confederacy was dying. Richmond was about to fall. And though Sherman's methods would be debated for generations, his march had done what 4 years of fighting could not. It had made the South understand that the war was lost. For the Union soldiers who had walked through fire and ruin, there was relief, but not celebration. They had seen the price of victory written across the land. Behind them lay a trail of ashes, but also the faint outline of a new America struggling to emerge. Sherman's march was more than a campaign. It was a turning point in history when the nation learned that victory sometimes demands not just courage, but total transformation. From the ruins of the Old South, a new Union would rise scarred, changed, but unshattered. By the early months of 1865, the American Civil War had entered its final, desperate phase. The Confederacy was collapsing under the weight of exhaustion, hunger, and despair. Its armies were in retreat, its cities smoldering, and its people starving. Yet its leaders refused to surrender. In Richmond, President Jefferson Davis still dreamed of independence, even as Union armies closed in from every direction. The war that had begun with bold declarations of honor and freedom now limped toward an inevitable, tragic end. In Virginia, General Robert E. Lee commanded the last great Confederate army, the Army of Northern Virginia. Once proud and invincible, it was now outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. Lee's men were starving. Horses dropped dead on the roadside. Ammunition was scarce. The supply lines that once fed his army from the deep South had been severed by Sherman's devastating campaigns. Yet Lee refused to give up. He believed that if he could somehow link his army with General Joseph E. Johnston's forces in North Carolina, they might prolong the war, perhaps long enough to force a negotiated peace. Facing him was General Ulysses S. Grant, commanding the massive Union Army of the Potomac. Grant had spent nearly a year hammering at Lee's defenses around Petersburg, the vital rail hub that supplied Richmond. The siege had dragged on since the summer of 1864, and both armies were worn thin. The trenches around Petersburg were a wasteland of mud, smoke, and corpses, a grim preview of modern warfare. Soldiers lived in filth, sleeping beside the dead, enduring relentless artillery fire and disease. But by March 1865, Grant was ready to strike. His army now numbered over 120,000 men, supported by endless supplies and reinforcements. Lee had barely 50,000, many of them barefoot and starving. The Confederate lines stretched thin for miles, and Grant knew it was only a matter of time before they broke. As the final assault began, the political winds were shifting in Washington. On March 4th, Abraham Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address, standing beneath the unfinished dome of the U.S. Capitol. Rain fell steadily as he spoke, his words solemn and filled with the weight of 4 years of bloodshed. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he said, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in to bind up the nation's wounds. Lincoln's vision was not of vengeance, but of healing. Yet he knew the war could not end until the Confederacy was utterly defeated. In April, that defeat finally came. On April 1st, 1865, Union forces under General Philip Sheridan broke through Confederate lines at Five Forks, west of Petersburg. The victory opened the way to the city, and Grant ordered a full assault. On the morning of April 2nd, the Union Army stormed the Confederate trenches. The defense collapsed. Richmond, the Confederate capital, was no longer tenable. That night, Davis and his government fled south by train as flames engulfed the city. Confederate soldiers, in retreat, had set fire to warehouses and ammunition depots to prevent their capture. By dawn, Richmond burned a hellish scene of collapsing buildings, explosions, and desperate civilians running through the streets. On April 3rd, Union troops marched into Richmond. The city that had symbolized rebellion now lay in ruins. African Americans, newly freed, cheered the arrival of the blue uniforms, shouting glory to God and freedom. Among the first Union officers to enter was Major General Godfrey Weitzel, who took formal control of the city. The same day, President Lincoln arrived by boat along the James River. When he walked through the charred streets of Richmond, he was surrounded by freedmen who fell to their knees in tears. Lincoln gently told them to rise, saying, "Don't kneel to me. You must kneel to God only, and thank Him for the liberty you will enjoy hereafter." Meanwhile, Lee's army retreated westward, trying desperately to reach supplies near Appomattox Station. But Grant's forces pursued relentlessly, cutting off every escape route. The Confederate soldiers marched through mud and hunger, some collapsing from exhaustion, others deserting to find food. Wagons broke down, horses died in the traces. On April 6th, at Sailor's Creek, nearly one-fourth of Lee's army was captured or killed. "My God, has the army dissolved?" Lee exclaimed when he heard the news. By April 8th, Grant's cavalry had seized the supply trains at Appomattox Station. The next morning, Lee's men attempted one last breakout. It failed almost immediately. Surrounded, Lee faced the unbearable truth: the war was over. On April 9th, 1865, at a small farmhouse in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, Robert E. Lee met Ulysses S. Grant to surrender. The contrast between the two men was striking. Lee arrived in full dress uniform, his sword polished, his demeanor proud but calm. Grant, in a mud-stained field coat, carried himself with quiet humility. The meeting was brief, dignified, and somber. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate soldiers were to lay down their arms and return home. Officers could keep their horses and sidearms. No one would be tried for treason. The men could take their personal property and go back to their farms. "We are all Americans again," Grant told Lee. As Lee rode away, Union soldiers began to cheer, but Grant silenced them. "The Confederates are our countrymen again," he said, "and the best sign of rejoicing after the victory will be to abstain from all demonstrations in the field." For Lee's soldiers, the surrender was both a relief and a heartbreak. Many wept openly as they stacked their rifles. Others stared silently into the distance. After 4 years of unimaginable sacrifice, it was over. In the following days, other Confederate armies surrendered one by one. Joseph E. Johnston surrendered to Sherman in North Carolina on April 26th, effectively ending major combat. The Confederate government dissolved. Jefferson Davis fled south, still hoping to rally resistance, but he was captured in Georgia on May 10th. The Confederate dream had died. The cost was staggering. Over 620,000 soldiers were dead, more than in all other American wars combined up to that point. Entire towns were emptied of young men. The South lay in ruins, its economy shattered, its cities burned. Nearly 4 million enslaved people were free, but their future was uncertain. In Washington, there was a moment of relief and quiet joy. Lincoln, exhausted but hopeful, spoke of reconciliation. He dreamed of rebuilding the Union, with malice toward none. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, he attended a play at Ford's Theater with his wife, Mary. As the audience laughed, a Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box and fired a single bullet into Lincoln's head. The president died the next morning. The nation's joy turned instantly to grief. In the streets of Washington, people wept openly. In the South, some mourned, others whispered that justice had been done. But for most Americans, North and South, Lincoln's death felt like a wound too deep to heal. Across the country, church bells tolled. His body was carried by train through grieving crowds from Washington to Springfield, Illinois. Millions stood in silence as the coffin passed. The man who had guided the Union through its darkest hour was gone, and with him went the hope of an easy peace. In the weeks that followed, the war truly ended. Confederate flags were lowered. Parades of returning Union soldiers filled the streets. But beneath the surface, deep scars remained that would shape the nation for generations. Reconstruction was coming, and with it, a new battle not of armies, but of ideas, justice, and survival. The Civil War had ended. The United States was one nation again, free, but fractured. Out of the ashes of war, a new chapter in American history was about to begin. On the night of April 14th, 1865, Washington, D.C., was alive with celebration. The long and terrible Civil War had finally ended. Confederate armies had surrendered, the Union was restored, and the dream of peace had begun to feel real at last. Gaslights glowed along Pennsylvania Avenue, crowds filled the streets, and laughter echoed from theaters and taverns. In the White House, President Abraham Lincoln, exhausted from years of unrelenting war, decided to enjoy a rare evening of leisure with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. They planned to attend a performance of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. It had been 5 days since Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Lincoln was still receiving visitors that afternoon, speaking of rebuilding the nation and welcoming the South back into the Union, with malice toward none, with charity for all. He looked lighter, freer, as though the burden of war had finally begun to lift. That morning, he had told his cabinet that he had dreamed of a ship sailing swiftly toward a shore, a dream he had often had before great events. But this time, it would be his last. At around 8:30 p.m., the Lincolns arrived at Ford's Theater. With them were Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. The play was lighthearted, filled with jokes and laughter, a welcome relief for a president who had spent 4 years presiding over bloodshed. As Lincoln took his seat in the presidential box, the audience rose to their feet and applauded. The orchestra struck up "Hail to the Chief." Lincoln smiled and bowed, then settled into his chair beside Mary. Meanwhile, in the shadows, another man moved through the theater with a dark purpose. His name was John Wilkes Booth, a 26-year-old actor, famous, charismatic, and consumed by rage. A Maryland native and Confederate sympathizer, Booth had long despised Lincoln. He believed the president had destroyed the South, enslaved white men to black rule, and trampled the Constitution. When the Confederacy fell, Booth's hatred hardened into obsession. He had originally plotted to kidnap Lincoln and exchange him for Confederate prisoners. But after Lee's surrender, he turned to murder. He saw himself as a modern Brutus striking down a tyrant for the sake of liberty. Booth knew Ford's Theater well. He had performed there many times. He slipped in easily, carrying a small Derringer pistol and a dagger. At around 10:10 p.m., as the play reached its funniest line, the one guaranteed to make the crowd roar with laughter, Booth crept up the narrow staircase to the presidential box. Inside, Lincoln sat relaxed, holding Mary's hand. Major Rathbone sat nearby, glancing toward the stage. At the precise moment of laughter, Booth pushed open the door, aimed his pistol, and fired. The single shot struck Lincoln in the back of the head. Mary screamed. Rathbone leapt at Booth, who slashed him deeply with his dagger and jumped from the box to the stage below, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis! Thus always to tyrants." His spur caught on the flag draping the box, and he landed awkwardly, breaking his leg. But he rose and fled, brandishing his knife as he pushed through the stunned audience and out the back door into the night. On stage, chaos erupted. The actors froze. The audience gasped, and for a moment, no one understood what had happened. Then word spread like fire. The president has been shot. Doctors in the audience rushed to the box. Lincoln was unconscious, barely breathing. They carried him across the street to a small boarding house, the Peterson House, and laid him on a narrow bed too short for his tall frame. Through the night, people gathered outside in silence. Inside, doctors tried desperately to save him, but the wound was fatal. The bullet had entered behind his left ear, passing through his brain. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, his face pale and grim, stood by the bedside, taking charge. Mary wept uncontrollably, clutching her husband's hand. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln took his final breath. Stanton looked down and said softly, "Now he belongs to the ages." The news spread across the city like thunder. Bells tolled, and men and women wept openly in the streets. Soldiers stood silent, their faces streaked with tears. In the South, reactions were mixed. Some grieved, others whispered that justice had been done. But even many former Confederates recognized the enormity of what had happened. The war had taken its final victim, not on the battlefield, but in a theater seat. Booth, meanwhile, was fleeing through the night. He rode hard into Maryland, his broken leg splinted crudely by a local doctor, Samuel Mudd. With a small band of Confederate sympathizers, he hid in swamps and barns for 12 days, pursued by cavalry and detectives. On April 26th, Union soldiers surrounded a tobacco barn near Port Royal, Virginia, where Booth and his accomplice, David Harold, were hiding. They demanded surrender. Harold gave up, but Booth refused. "I prefer to come out and fight," he shouted. When the barn was set ablaze, Booth tried to flee, and a Union sergeant, Boston Corbett, fired a single shot. The bullet struck Booth in the neck. He died within hours, whispering, "Useless, useless." Back in Washington, the city was draped in mourning. Black cloth hung from every window, and church bells tolled without end. Lincoln's body lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda, where thousands filed past to pay their respects. Then began the funeral procession, one of the largest the world had ever seen. His coffin traveled by train from Washington to Springfield, Illinois, stopping in major cities along the way. Millions of Americans came to see him weeping, praying, standing in silence as the train passed through the night. The route retraced the same path Lincoln had taken to the Capitol 4 years earlier, when he had come full of hope to lead a divided nation. In New York City, crowds packed Broadway, black banners draped from every building. In Cleveland and Chicago, choirs sang hymns as mourners stood in the rain. Finally, on May 4th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery, Springfield. The war had made him a martyr, a symbol of sacrifice and unity. But in the White House, grief turned to anger and fear. The assassination had been part of a wider conspiracy. That same night, Booth's accomplices had attempted to murder Vice President Andrew Johnson. At first, many Northerners hoped Johnson would continue Lincoln's plan of mercy and reform. But almost immediately, he began restoring power to former Confederates. By the end of 1865, every Southern state had formed a new government that passed what became known as the Black Codes. These laws sought to control the freedom of African Americans, restricting their movement, limiting their labor, and in many places, forcing them into contracts not far removed from slavery itself. In response, Congress took control of Reconstruction, led by men like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. The radical Republicans insisted that true peace could only come through justice, through protecting the rights of the freed slaves and reshaping the South's political order. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, granting citizenship to all people born in the United States, regardless of race. When Johnson vetoed it, Congress overrode him, the first time in American history that such a major veto was overturned. That same year, the 14th Amendment was introduced. It guaranteed equal protection under the law and extended citizenship to formerly enslaved people. Ratified in 1868, it became one of the most important amendments in American history, reshaping the Constitution to align with the ideals Lincoln had voiced at Gettysburg. But ideals alone could not rebuild the South. The economy had collapsed. Plantations stood empty. The currency was worthless, and millions faced starvation. The federal government created the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency designed to provide food, education, and legal aid to freedmen and refugees. In a few short years, it helped build more than 3,000 schools and trained thousands of black teachers. For the first time, education became a path out of bondage. In churches, schools, and small communities, freedmen gathered to define what freedom meant. They built new lives, formed families long separated by slavery, and founded independent black churches, places of worship that would become the heart of African American life for generations. But their newfound rights faced constant danger. Across the South, resentment simmered among white populations who could not accept the end of slavery or the presence of federal troops enforcing equality. Out of that bitterness rose terror. In 1866, a secret organization emerged in Tennessee, the Ku Klux Klan. Dressed in white robes and hoods, its members called themselves Knights, claiming to protect Southern honor. In truth, they waged a campaign of fear and violence, burning schools, murdering freedmen, and attacking anyone, white or black, who supported Reconstruction. Night after night, the Klan rode through the countryside, leaving behind a trail of blood and silence. The federal government tried to fight back. Congress passed the Enforcement Acts in 1870 and 1871, giving President Ulysses S. Grant, now in the White House, the power to crush the Klan and protect black voters. Federal troops arrested hundreds, and for a time, the violence subsided. But the deeper struggle continued, one not fought with guns, but with laws, intimidation, and ballots. During this time, African Americans began to hold office for the first time in U.S. history. Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first black U.S. senator in 1870, taking the seat once held by Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. Dozens of black men served in Congress, hundreds more in state legislatures, and thousands in local offices. It was a revolutionary transformation that proved that democracy could expand beyond the narrow boundaries of race and class. But Reconstruction faced relentless opposition. White supremacist groups found new ways to undermine progress, while Northern fatigue grew. The North had sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives and billions of dollars. Many were ready to move on. Corruption scandals in Grant's administration and economic depression in the 1870s weakened public support for federal intervention in the South. Meanwhile, Southern whites organized politically under what they called redemption. They aimed to redeem their states from Republican control and restore white supremacy through intimidation, fraud, and violence. Election after election, black voters were driven from the polls. Reconstruction governments began to fall one by one. The 15th Amendment, ratified in 1870, had promised that no citizen could be denied the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But in practice, this right was systematically stripped away. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright terror turned the promise of democracy into an illusion for millions of black Southerners. By the mid-1870s, the nation's attention had shifted. The frontier was expanding westward, industry was booming, and a new generation looked toward progress rather than justice. The moral urgency that had fueled the abolitionist movement faded into fatigue. Then came the election of 1876, one of the most disputed in U.S. history. The Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, faced Democrat Samuel J. Tilden. Tilden won the popular vote and appeared to win the electoral vote, but contested results in 3 Southern states led to chaos. To resolve the crisis, a deal was struck in the Compromise of 1877. In exchange for Hayes becoming president, Republicans agreed to withdraw the last federal troops from the South. With that withdrawal, Reconstruction officially ended. The fragile experiment in racial democracy collapsed. Southern states quickly imposed new systems of segregation and disenfranchisement, known as Jim Crow laws, which would last for nearly a century. For the freedmen and women who had tasted liberty, the promise of freedom was replaced by a harsh new reality. Sharecropping tied them to the land in poverty. Lynchings enforced racial terror, and the dream of equality faded into distant memory. Yet, even in the darkest times, the seeds planted during Reconstruction education, community, and self-determination would endure. Those seeds would one day grow into the movements that fought for civil rights in the 20th century. In the years after 1877, the nation moved on. The Civil War and Reconstruction became distant memories for many Americans. But for those who had lived through it, the scars remained. The war had destroyed slavery, but it had not destroyed racism. It had preserved the Union, but it had left the meaning of freedom unfinished. Reconstruction had been America's second founding, a moment when the nation tried to rebuild itself not just in body, but in principle. For 12 years, it seemed that the ideals of equality and democracy might truly take root. But by 1877, that dream was deferred. The United States would carry the weight of that unfinished promise deep into the next century. And yet, despite its failure, Reconstruction left behind something indestructible, a constitutional foundation that would one day be reclaimed. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments remained the moral bedrock of America, waiting for another generation to awaken their full power. From the ashes of war and betrayal, they preserved the idea that freedom was not a gift, but a right. The battle for that right would continue in courts, in marches, in voices that refused to be silenced. The Civil War had freed the body. Reconstruction had tried to free the soul. Both left behind a legacy of struggle, sacrifice, and hope, the ongoing story of a nation still learning what it means to be truly united.